My great aunt was having a conversation with my mom. My mom is a Sanders supporter. She has a bit of age on her. She's elderly. And so she bucks the trend in regards to Sanders support among African Americans. And she's having this conversation trying to push Sanders on my aunt, great aunt, grandmother's sister, tells my mom directly, passionately, Joe Biden is our only choice. Now, she doesn't say Joe Biden is the only choice because she loves Joe Biden. This was said pointedly out of outright abject terror. From her standpoint, Joe Biden is the only one in that race that can be sold to the 60 some odd, nearly 70% white demographic in the country itself. Everybody else is a risky prospect that can't necessarily win. Joe Biden, she's known for years. Joe Biden was with Obama. Joe Biden is electable. Now, she's saying this only out of her frame of reference. The only people she talked to are people who are around her, many of which, for the most part, are similar to her in her political temperament, many of which may be African American, many of which may be elderly, and many of them, for the most part, have a similar temperament built out by the environment to which they've lived. They are their world. They are their experiences. My mom, in this case, is like, no, you don't have to do that. Now, we say they don't have to do that. By the same token, if you look at it from their perspective, they brought up in the 50s and the 60s. My grandmother was, if I am not mistaken, only 2 generations from slavery, meaning she used to wash the clothes for people and everything else. But her family members at one point remember people who were slaves. It wasn't that long ago. My grandmother is 80s, maybe 90. This is within her memory. This is within her experience. They grew up in the 50s. They grew up in the 60s. They saw King get shot, Jack Kennedy get shot, Bobby Kennedy get shot, Malcolm X get shot, Medgar Evers. They saw all of these people being wiped off the playing field who represented civil rights and the interests of African Americans in this country. The Democratic Party, whatever you want to think of it now, at one point reached out to the African American community at a time where the African American community was, for the most part, on the margins, second-class citizens, ruled in a state by essentially, for all intents and purposes, ethno-fascists. And one of the main political parties reached out. As the Democratic Party and the African American vote got more, let's say, tethered to one another, the ethno-fascists jumped out of the Democratic Party and went running into the Republican Party. Now, as this propagated, you're talking about a relationship that was formed over the course of 40, 50, 60 years? And at this point, African Americans vote 90% Democrat? That's not magic. That's entirely built out of the history of this particular country. The youth vote, meaning the people who are voting Sanders whole hog, have all sorts of incentives in order to vote for Sanders based on their own living situation, from the standpoint of debt, poverty, wealth, college debt, job market. When they get out, there's all sorts of threats and terrors that await them, that they are absolutely certain that await them, that the older generation don't have to live through. The older generation lived through an entirely different time from the perspective of the nation itself and what was considered the hegemonic norm. Different worlds. Just because there's society change, the society is not an absolute. It is, to some degree, a large part of your perspective of that. Their perspective, again, is built out of 50s, 60s, 70s, African Americans getting beat on the streets, shot by cops, with a society that doesn't even acknowledge it, as if it never even happened. At the very least, as bad as it is now, you at least have a cell phone where you can point to that and say, hey, this indeed happened. My point here is the reason why the African American vote, the older African American vote, goes that much to Joe Biden is because from their standpoint, Joe Biden is a person that is sellable to the rest of the nation. Everybody else is a risky prospect. And the main modus operandi of the African American vote, especially, almost specifically, the older demographic, keep the monsters at bay. The younger demographic in this society was never brought up in a society with a racial tension and pressure that was there like in the 60s. This, talking about it now, doesn't compare. I'm sorry, it doesn't compare. They are firmly aware of what that was like. They lived through it, and what they know is keep the monsters at bay. And the person that they're going to support is the person that they believe has the best chance of keeping the monsters at bay. In this very specific instance, in this very specific race, that person is Joe Biden. But let's just be very clear. That's not love. That's terror. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. So guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. One of my Twitter followers asked sincerely, why on earth are these darkies voting for Joe Biden? Now, from the standpoint of African Americans, we don't have two parties, we have one. Now, whites, and maybe some of the other demographics, I've never lived as an Asian, so I don't necessarily know. They may have their voting choices, but ultimately, African Americans only have one. Whites may vote for somebody who may fuck them over economically, but from the standpoint of African Americans, the monsters are in the other party, and those monsters go beyond this notion of entirely just economics. It is a fear that is brought about by the history, the violent history of this particular country. In our heads, the monsters are in the other party. I don't necessarily think this is wrong, per se. Not necessarily an entirety of the party, of course, but you only need a 20% amount for that to be somewhat of a terrifying reality. And we are very clearly, almost ingrained in our DNA, clear that the monsters are another party. How do you keep the monsters at bay? How do you keep the monsters at bay? And if that means supporting one party in order to stop the other, then that's what takes place. African Americans, 90% Democrat, Jesus Christ, Democrat, even in a off year, meaning even with somebody like a Hillary Clinton, you would still get a vote share that is that high. Right now, older African Americans are supporting a man that got on the stage and said this.
Talk to you about inequality in schools and race. In a conversation about how to deal with segregation in schools back in 1975, you told a reporter, "I don't feel responsible for the sins of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago." You said that some 40 years ago. But as you stand here tonight, what responsibility do you think that Americans need to take to repair the legacy of slavery in our country?
Well, they have to deal with look, there is institutional segregation in this country. And from the time I got involved, I started dealing with that. Redlining, banks, making sure that we are in a position where, look, we talk about education. I propose that what we take is those very poor schools, the Title I schools, triple the amount of money we spend from 15 to 45 billion a year. Give every single teacher a raise to the equal raise of getting out the $60,000 level. Number two, make sure that we bring in to help the teachers deal with the problems that come from home. The problems that come from home, we have one school psychologist for every 1,500 kids in America today. It's crazy. The teachers are retired. I'm married to a teacher. My deceased wife is a teacher. They have every problem coming to them. We have to make sure that every single child does, in fact, have 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds go to school, not daycare, school. We bring social workers into homes and parents to help them deal with how to raise their children. It's not that they don't want to help. They don't know quite what to do. Play the radio, make sure the television, make sure you have the record player on at night, the phone, make sure the kids hear words. A kid coming from
Joe Biden has just said that African Americans, because presumably this is who he was talking about, don't know how to raise their kids. You should play record players. And this is coming from a man with a crackhead son that got drummed out of the military. Forget the corruption part. Not to mention this answer was entirely incoherent. I could show that to somebody who's an older black, and they would still look at that and say, Joe Biden is our only choice. That is quite possibly the most racist answer I've ever heard, Democrat or Republican. And they would still say Joe Biden is our only choice. It's not about love. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It's not that they love the candidate or that the candidate is the greatest thing since sliced bread. That literally has nothing to do with it. It's not even that they're necessarily low information voters. It has everything to do with the reason that they're voting for a particular person, meaning everybody has various reasons that they vote for people. In this very specific case, this demographic, African Americans, older, monsters at bay, bar the door. What's the guy that can do it? I don't really care if Joe Biden said this. I care that he can hold that door shut. That's the answer. That's the answer. The catch here is that's not love, that's terror. And that's somewhat of a sad way to vote for a particular candidate, even though it is to some degree true that that's the reason why they vote for candidates, or we vote for candidates in this way. It makes the primary that much more important. Whoever the Democratic candidate is, when they get out of the race, they will get that support regardless. That could be Sanders, that could be Warren. Buttigieg less so, because Buttigieg can't even get the black vote now. But I guess my point is, whatever the Democratic candidate is, all things being equal, they will get that support. And that's the reason. It doesn't matter the candidate. It matters that there's a D that's stopping the R. Racial politics. But that racial politics, again, is born out of the history of this particular country that deemed that racial politics necessary. That doesn't act, it still aggravates me. It still aggravates me. The younger demographic of African Americans, however, are not doing politics in that way. This is New York Times just ran an article today. Black voters to candidates representation is not enough. Now, that is more so younger black voters. If you look at the vote tally in regards to the breakdown in demographic, Sanders wins young voters whole hog across the board. Even black voters, meaning young black voters are not indistinct from the other black voters, or for the other voters in the demographic. All of them have various issues that are pertaining to class. And all of them realizes, especially from the standpoint of the way they get their information, that that is not settled by a Joe Biden, who at one point said that, get over yourself to young voters who were complaining about being held down with student debt. This is a $1.2 trillion of debt that is on the back of the middle class across the board. Black, white, gay, straight, transgender, etc. Biden is not going to do anything about that. Sanders will. The class priorities are different, but there's also a priority from the standpoint of the way different groups, and in this particular, a group that was born out and lived in that experience, soaked in it, not reading back on it, soaked in it. That's the way they vote. That's the way they think. I can't fault them for that. I don't even know how to change their mind per se on that. On the positive here is that the young voters in this case are voting for different reasons in this notion of just racial politics, mainly because they didn't live in the 60s. They don't have that experience ingrained in them in that way. So they vote differently. That is a positive. That is a massive positive. The younger demographic is going to be the largest vote tally in this election cycle. Great. And from my experience, at least going back to Obama in 2008, African Americans weren't supporting Obama in 2008. Did you know that? I don't know if most people know that. When Obama first started running in that race, Clinton was the inevitable one in that race. African Americans were supporting Hillary Clinton. It was only after it became clear that Obama could win that the people moved to Obama. But he wasn't the original favorite in that race, even among African Americans. I guess my point here is, and by the way, you have other African Americans in this race. Cory Booker out there begging for votes. And yet they go to Joe Biden. My point is that it really does boil down to who keeps the monsters at bay. And that's for having Obama in that race in 2008. Still talented politically, and to not be the vote favorite. Up until the point it became clear that he could win. All of it consistently has been on this notion of electability. If it becomes clear that one of the other candidates are just as electable as Joe Biden, I said it from the beginning, his tally will start to shrivel up and go away. I've said this on more than one occasion. I've been saying this for months. Electability is a fickle mistress. If my great aunt is watching the election tallies and she sees that New Hampshire, Iowa, she sees 3 states go to Bernie Sanders early on, the question of electability may change. The politics of electability really does depend on who you think is more electable. And if they find somebody else who's just as electable as you are and have other traits, that vote tally will shrivel up. Joe Biden better be very careful, because that group of African Americans can go away very soon if it comes across as if there's somebody else who's just as better, if not him. Trudy, stop dissing boomers. We're war protesting hippies who wanted free, poor for the food. I'm not bashing you, Trudy. I've never said the okay boomer stuff. Keep in mind, for me, in my head, all of this stuff is just born out of experience. People are, I don't want to say robots, but they are, I tried to tell my niece one time, I was having a conversation with her about a friend of hers, a guy, and she says, oh, he's just a good friend. And I said, does he know that? She says, yeah, he's just a guy. He's just a friend of mine. And I tried to point out to her that oftentimes guys who are quote unquote just friends are not hanging around really to just be your friend, even though you might have put him in the friend zone. It's very possible that in his head, he wants something else. And she's like, nope, that's not it at all. That's not it at all. Now, I have, 15 years more experience than she's been alive, and maybe 40 years more experience of being a guy. Between the two, I think I'm right. In fact, I'm almost certain that I'm right. She doesn't know that. She doesn't have the experience. A, she's a female, meaning she doesn't soak in a guy's body, but she also hasn't had that 15-year difference or 20-year difference experience of interacting with other human beings in the way that the sexes relate to one another. It is impossible for her to know what I know in that sense. The same thing is true for the people who are living in the 60s. It is impossible for people who were born in 2000-something to know what they were soaking in for 20, 30, 40 years or the entirety of their life, meaning the majority of their life almost, or a large segment of their life, their formative years, were spent at a time that we consider dystopian. You can't be mad at them for that vote, even though that vote may be somewhat aggravating. I hope that's what you understand what I mean. That's not a ding on them. That's an acknowledgement of reality, Trudy. I hope you understand my point, Trudy. I'm not dinging older. People who are older. Oh, not you, JP. Okay, fair enough. I made that argument for no reason. Trolls equal hypocrites with hypocritical screen names. That's funny. But on the other hand, you have met the kid or seen them interact. But on the other hand, have you met the kid and seen them interact? God, no. That's true. I haven't. Fair enough. I haven't. But. This is like asking, we haven't really seen Prince Andrew interact with Jeffrey Epstein. But you can look at his actions. And, from your standpoint, Garden, how many guys do you know that have had friends that are female and that have wanted something more in that relationship, and she's dropped them in the friend zone? And maybe from her perspective, this is what this is. This is what I'm going to continue to keep this to be. Doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have it is. I consider him to be a guy. I don't know that as a flat fact. That's true. But do I think percentages are on my side? Absolutely. Absolutely. Ashley Lauren. I have one-on-one convos with boomers. It's hard for them to come to terms with Hillary not being who they thought she was. Slowly they're getting it. It is. It's just different. It's different. Like, if you look back, look back at that old Reagan video. So that video where Reagan comes out for the Iran-Contra affair, that video, it's so different. It's so different than what we have in politics right now. Reagan comes out, he's sitting at the desk, and he gives this kind of golly gee shucks. I didn't know that we were selling weapons and then dumping that money into terrorists who are trying to take over South America. I didn't know that at all. I didn't know that the Sandinistas were being fought with money that we were selling arms with. Golly shucks. But the buck stops with me. I'm the gipper. And so, yeah, I'm sorry about that. And it goes off. And there's this nice little, sound, or a little bit of music for the presidential address. It is a Warren and Beaver-esque political error. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's like that video of Reagan saying that. Reagan would have been ripped apart today if Reagan came out with a video like that. He would have been ripped apart for A, he's selling money, Reagan is lying through his teeth, etc., and everything in between. Nobody would say Reagan was lying, at least not from the standpoint of the way mainstream media was looking at it. Gipper didn't know. Oh well. I mean, you must understand what politicians said back then was it. It wasn't this massive distrust. It wasn't all of these guys are liars. It wasn't that. It was something fundamentally different. I guess I'm saying, when I get older, I would imagine to have various traits that I've dragged with me from the last 40 years. I suppose that's true of them also. I suppose that's true of everyone. How people will live in 40, 50 years would in many respects will be determined about the traits and everything else that they've accumulated. Now, they're not different. I mean, I'm not going to hit boomers for that stuff. Yeah, I'm not going to hit boomers for that stuff. I find myself getting older, man. And, you know, it's, like there's, like cartoons. I don't like the most recent cartoons. I think they're trash. Much of the music today that comes out, I think it's trash. By the same token, I have people who are in their 50s and 60s who say the same shit to me. It's like, it's getting worse. You drag that stuff with you. It's hard. Garden, I have female friends. I don't have designs on, but some I do. This is the way humans operate. Yes, that's my point, Garden. Then why are you giving me shit about that? That's the way humans operate. That's what I'm saying. Why are you giving me shit about it? You just agreed. I can't take it as an absolute. I've had female friends, maybe like two, there was nothing on it. It was just friendships. I've had others that I have lusted after viciously, and they would only modestly give me the time of day or something. Like, I don't know. I think all things being equal, given opportunities, things happen. Bartholomew Blunderbuss, who was the Democratic president to truly benefited Black Americans in any great way, and what was his name? Well, if you're talking about the civil rights legislation, the voting rights legislation, I think that was LBJ. John F. Kennedy, to some degree, started pushing for civil rights stuff. In a weird way, there's a story dealing with Nixon, like Nixon and Martin Luther King. That stuff gets a little weird. But if you're talking about civil rights, voting rights, I think that was LBJ. Yeah. As far as I know, you should hear those speeches when Martin Luther King does his Civil War, his Vietnam speech, and LBJ flips the fuck out. Who's that nigga out there doing so and so? I mean, just because LBJ was helping or going with this African American stuff doesn't mean he wasn't viciously racist. The catch here is we're talking about a time frame, a time capsule. That behavior was completely acceptable in the standpoint of the way society accepted it. And I said that weird, but you get my point. The people who were soaking in it, they were soaking in it. It was their life. 80 music was not the best. When you declare certainty on a topic, you invite rebuttal. That's true. Yes, that's true. There's a probability of a chance that he is either gay or he is just asexual. That's true. All right. I'm going to end this. We were fucking around. Oh, by the way, Patreon appreciation will be tonight at 7 p.m. I probably should have said that in the beginning as opposed to waiting to 23 minutes in. When I talk about the next one, I'll bring that up. But patron appreciation will be 7 p.m. today. Mrs. Thomas didn't feel all that well yesterday. I like it when she's with me on the show. So she is properly medicated today. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.